Savaşın yarattığı yıkımın çocuklar üzerindeki etkisi ömür boyu sürüyor. Filistin'deki insan hakları ihlallerini belgeleyen sivil toplum kuruluşu ABD verilerine göre Filistin-İsrail Savaşında yaşanan 10 binin üzerindeki ölümün 2000'den fazlası çocuklara ait. Ancak bu 7 Ekim 2023'te başlayan yoğun çatışmaların öncesindeki veriler. Sonrasındaki süreçte de 19 binden fazla ölümün yaşandığı açık kaynaklarca ifade ediliyor. Bunların da 8 binden fazlası çocuk ölümlerine ait. Yani Gazze saldırılarında geçmişten günümüze en az 10 bin çocuk öldürüldü. Bir diğer çatışma da Ukrayna-Rusya arasında mevcut. BM verilerinde 9614 Ukraynalı sivilin öldürüldüğü, bunların 554'ünün çocuk olduğu biliniyor. BBC'deki bir haberde ise ABD Savunma Bakanlığı 70 binden fazla ölümün gerçekleştiğini iddia ediyor. Net rakamlar ne olursa olsun savaşın yıkımı yok sayılamaz bir gerçeklik. Dünyanın birçok yerinde savaş ve çatışmalar sürerken bunlardan en fazla siviller ve çocuklar etkileniyor. Savaşta çocuklar ölüm ve yaralanmanın dışında aynı zamanda hak ihlallerine de maruz kalıyor. Bazıları kaçırılıyor, asker olarak kullanılıyor, istismar ediliyor, mülteci olmak zorunda kalıyor ya da gittikleri ülkelerde psikolojik ve sosyal sorunlar yaşıyorlar.
Біля 5:00 ранку нам подзвонив наш друг і сказав, що почалось. Тобто з Криму прийшли русські воєнні і почали обстрілювати наш Херсон. Коли захватили наше місто, це був мій день народження, а через день був день народження мого сина. І ми його зустріли в підвалі. Це було дуже тяжко як психологічно, так і фізично, тому що було небезпечно виходити з дому, і тільки мій чоловік їздив по місту, шукав якісь там відкриті магазини, де ще була їда і якісь ліки. Ввечері і вночі в місті ніхто не вмикав світло вдома, тому що вже по місту ходили російські солдати, і аби вони не зайшли в твій дім, всі робили вигляд, що вже покинули місто. Ну, а вже ж це було вже неможливо там знаходитись, і ми вирішили виїхати з міста, тому що не було можливості навчатися, працювати і взагалі жити. На той час йшли тяжкі бої між Херсоном і Ніколаєвом, це наступне місто, і ось ми не могли переїхати з міста з Херсона в Ніколаїв, тому що там було поле боя. Не знаю. Що стосовно школи, руські солдати ходили по місту і вони склоняли директорів шкіл почати працювати з ними. І директор нашої школи не захотіла стати колаборантом, вона не захотіла працювати на Росію, тому школу закрили. Але продовжувала якийсь час працювати онлайн. Ну, досі теж школа працює онлайн. З нашого класу всі учні виїхали з Херсона в березні або пізніше, я точно не знаю. Ну, знаю, що вони роз'їхались по різним країнам Європи, в Іспанію і ми в Туреччину виїхали. Якщо говорити про ті 3-4 тижні, що ми були в окупації, якось ми хотіли якось продовжувати нормальне життя. Ми хотіли сина якось привезти на день народження до його друга, але розвернулися, тому що там стояли воєнні, і вони стояли з автоматами, і ми просто не могли приїхати там за адресою.
So the book that's here is mine from my war childhood. It's White Fang, and the connection to it, it's very simple because we read a lot during the war. there wasn't much to do, so we read even the books that were not for our age. And this one is actually for my age, and the connection with it and why I find it so emotional is my dog, Lila, that we had to leave. And I also have a letter and a picture with her in this museum. So yeah, that's the emotional connection. We just had to leave her home because our home was on the front line and the soldiers came to tell us that we need to leave. So there she was, just loyal and brave and didn't know what to expect. My parents told me that we will be back in 2 or 3 days. And yeah, there's that scene where I just see my dog sitting and me waving her from the car, and that was the last time I saw her. The information that I got not long after is that the soldiers, our soldiers, killed her because she was showing their positions, because she was barking and, you know, being loyal and protecting the house and, of course, waiting for us, and that never happened.
Ну, я б зрозуміла. Ну, що стосовно життєбезпеки, тобто у нас все нормально. Ми дякуємо Туреччині за те, що тут продовжується нормальне життя нас і нашої дитини, але психологічно вже ж він дуже-дуже сумує за своїми друзями, і йому тяжко соціалізуватися було в перший рік, тому що він не знає мови, і він пішов до турецької школи без знання мови, і це йому трохи тяжко. Ну, все ж таки він дуже сумує за домом. От мені прислали фото нашого дому з Херсона, там де випав сніг, і я показала сину, і він такий, ну все, я їду до Херсона. Нам тут дуже подобається, тут дуже затишно, тут у нас є українська спілка, ми всі спілкуємось, допомагаємо один одному. Тут гарна погода, все взагалі добре, але наш дім в Херсоні. Найважливіше, що хочу додати, те, що тисячі дітей вивезли до Росії з окупованих територій. Вони їх вивозили під предлогом надати добрі условия, то есть каких-то умови. І я знаю випадки, коли наші херсонські матері їздили до Криму повернути дітей, і їм їх не видавали. Казали, що у вас немає російського гражданства, тому ми вам не віддамо дітей.
So the story of the War Childhood Museum started during the work on the War Childhood book. What inspired Yasmin Kohalilovich to start with this project was, to an extent, his own personal story of being a child during the war. But more than that, it was over 1,000 people who had shared their stories for this book. They had all answered the question, what was a war childhood for you? They had to answer it in a very short amount of space. And what was very obvious was that people hadn't been talking about these experiences before, and that they connected these stories to particular objects that were very special to them. So the whole story of the War Childhood Museum was connected to the community's response and its need to, on an individual and on the collective level, share more of these stories, of these experiences, and overcome the trauma, the effects of war to an extent, so making them more visible, the effects themselves, and making the stories, individual ones, more visible to diverse audiences, people coming from many different contexts who may or may not be as familiar about the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Of course, the idea was envisioned to include anyone who was a child during the war. So the scope of the museum's work has been increasing over time.
Presence and the existence of museum is really, really significant and important for all of us survivors, especially the children. That's why I actually donated my stuff that I cherished during the war as memories, as arguments of something that I went through. So I find Museum of War Childhood extremely important in terms of remembering and in terms of just spreading the message of how war is destructive, how that experience should never ever be repeated, and that no child in any part of the world should ever experience that. Today is the anniversary of Dayton's Agreement, which is emotional because in 1995, on this day, my war childhood ended. So there were just, people that signed the agreement, and shellings and snipers and all the horror stopped. So that's why I see museum as an impactful and very important institution. It really helped me in my own facing the memories and everything that I've been through in terms of coming here and experience it all over again, having this war action movie in my head every time I come here, but still something that reminds me of the respect about all the people that went through similar things like me, and not just children from Sarajevo, where I'm from, but all over the world where museum is present. So spreading the message of no war to any place in the world is really, really important for me, and that's the sole idea why I became a part of it and its mission. And I'm really grateful for that.
When it comes to, in particular, children from Syria and children from Ukraine, the museum started to document these stories in 2018, so very soon after the museum opened. Today we have an office in Ukraine, a local team that has documented over 300 objects of children who have been affected by war in Ukraine, going back to 2014, but also to the full-scale war erupting in 2022. When it comes to children from Syria, these stories were documented in 3 refugee camps in Lebanon. In the meantime, we would later on start to document these stories in Bosnia and Herzegovina as well, with children on the move coming from many different countries, including Syria. What was important for our methodology and how it changed was the fact that in Bosnia we were working with adults who were remembering what it was like to be a child during the war, and for children who were living as refugees and many internally displaced children in Ukraine, and now as well refugees in many different countries in Europe, they were still living through the consequences of armed conflicts erupting in their countries. So what we had to modify, what we had to keep in mind was that these stories were still unfolding, and we approached the documentation of the stories in a slightly different way. Different educational activities were conducted with children, and these interviews weren't really interviews. This story sharing happened more spontaneously, more naturally. One thing that in general is universal when it comes to the sharing of the stories is that simply the act of retelling what has happened and giving a voice to certain memories and experiences is already a healing act to an extent, and something that puts into focus the children's experiences with the aim of also underlining that war should never be an option.
Çocukların gözünden savaşı görmek, onların gözünden, dünyasından, etraflarında neler olduğunu okuyabilmek çok değerli tabii. Hepsinin sığınma yeri buldukları bir bebeğin gözlerinin içine bakarak ya bir ayıcığa sarılarak ya da bir geçmişten bir oyuncağı yanlarından asla ayırmayarak nasıl içlerinde bulundukları durumu farklı bir dünyadaymışçasına yaşadıklarını buradan okuduklarımdan ve gördüklerimden anladığımı söyleyebilirim. Bu müze aslında savaşın unutmamak, hatırlamak adına çok önemli bir müze olduğunu söylemek istiyorum. Bu tabii ki kin tutmak ve asla unutmamak ve bununla yaşamak anlamına gelmesin lütfen. Sadece unutmayalım, hatırlayalım ki savaşın hiçbir zaman hiçbir kazananı olmaz, olmayacaktır. Bugün de içinde bulunduğumuz dünyaya keşke bu mesajı verebilsek.
So up until now, the museum has documented over 5,000 objects, or 5,000 objects are in its collection, and the stories connected to them are related to 17 different armed conflicts. So from the get-go, the museum's mission was to open up its collection to anyone who was a child during the war, and for this reason as well, the museum has been expanding its scope outside of Bosnia-Herzegovina, outside of the region, in the Middle East, and more recently in Asia, in Africa. So it's very important for us to document all of these stories. In regards to the stories of children from Palestine, we have had, thanks to an external collaborator, we have had over 20 of these stories documented in the period of 2021 up until 2022. The stories themselves were, many of them were documented in the middle of very heavy shelling, ongoing hostilities, and or rather they relate to this period. So in regards to the current events, of course it is the museum's openness and wish to document these and any other stories that are currently happening in the world today. So currently we have a virtual exhibition on the museum's website that showcases some of these stories. At this point, there are many factors that affect when and how these stories can be collected. Maybe some of them will be collected in countries of Europe with refugee children. I am not sure as to how this research will be conducted and when, but there is definitely an intention to continue documenting these stories, same as was done with the children from Syria, some of them living as refugees in Lebanon, and later on documenting and continuing to document any story of a child passing through Bosnia and Herzegovina. In general, when it comes to what we've noticed, the museum keeps an open database that indicates, that really underlines many multifaceted effects of wars on children. This is open to researchers. There haven't really been academic papers or research produced by the museum itself, but its collection and its openness has helped others who are dealing with this topic to come up with certain guidelines, to come up with certain findings in regards to war's impact on children. In particular, our colleagues in Ukraine have been collaborating with psychologists, with different experts in the field during this more recent documentation process, and these sort of findings, this is something that is absolutely invaluable for future work in these fields, and this is something that will be exchanged.